Women's rights activist Kellie-Jay Keen has had a very busy week, as you will have seen, enraging lefties from our nation's capitals all the way over to New Zealand. In fact, the outrage was so noisy that the immigration department in New Zealand debated whether Kelly should even be allowed into the country. Nice one, New Zealand, the land of freedom. Yes, great. But if you want to know what really happened, where the aggression and hatred is really coming from, this footage from the protest says it's all. Well, now joining us is Katherine Deves, great friend of this show. You'll remember, of course, she ran as a Liberal candidate and a great advocate for women's and girls' rights, particularly in sports. Katherine, great to see you. You were following the Kellie-Jay Keen. You were with her at many of those events. Tell us the real story. What really happened?
Good morning, outsiders. So I asked the question, is this what love winning looks like? We constantly hear about love wins. Is this what it looks like? Violence against women. And I would like to say that I'm quite pleased that we have a Labor majority in New South Wales Parliament, because it means that Men's will no longer have to negotiate with the likes of Alex Greenwich. Now, Alex Greenwich wants to push through legislation, the Equality Bill. I hope it's going to be shelved now. That will see women's rights completely dismantled. Now, with Kellie-Jay Keen's Let Women Speak campaign, she travelled to all the capital cities in Australia, bar Darwin, simply to give a platform to women who wish to speak to their lived experience. Now, part of that is the encroachment into women's rights of men who want to pretend to be women and come into our spaces. Now, many of these women simply want to say no to this. They were talking about their own experiences, how it's impacting them in their jobs, etc. And what it's done is it's ripped the Band-Aid off, and it's displayed to Australia, New Zealand and indeed the world the festering wound that is transactivism. Now, the violence against women down in Melbourne, where we had the extreme left and the extreme right come out, surround us. The police were complicit in allowing the extreme right to join the fracas. And I can barely tell the difference between the socialists waving their red flags and the neo-Nazis. And indeed, we had the Australian Jewish Association come out in our defence to denounce the Nazis and say that we had absolutely nothing to do with them. The fact that these men, these violent, vicious, malignant men come out of their basements, they're getting off, you know, they're on Mastodon, they're on porn, they come out and they were attacking women, they were highly intimidating, they made direct threats of violence, and in all of this, it's the women's voices that are lost, and the women are now being blamed for the men's violence. What happened to Kellie-Jay over in New Zealand? Well, people are saying, oh, well, you know, you asked for it, you came here, you wanted to speak out, and for that reason, you know, that witch hunting mob that surrounded her and actually put her life at risk to the point where she had to leave the country. And all she is doing is saying that women have the right to sex-based rights. We have the right to say no to men in spaces where women and children are vulnerable. So Australians really need to wake up to this. We really need our men folk. We need good and decent men, and there were quite a lot that stood beside us on this campaign, my own husband included. He stood with me in Sydney. We need the men to get behind us, because we are seeing these violent, deranged people who want to get access to women and children, and we need to stand up and we need to start saying no.
James.
What is the role of the media, Katherine, in kicking some of this off? Because so much of the language and narrative you hear around this, they call them anti-trans protesters, which makes it sound like, you know, they're bigoted and transphobic and, you know, want to... And I was listening on the radio this morning, I heard a news bulletin where, you know, they were saying these protests are the anti-trans stuff, the women's Spaces rallies have blood on their hands, and somehow that this is where the violence is coming from, you know, the words of a Kellie-Jay Keen. How did that framing happen, and how do you fight that?
So we're being blamed for the violence being inflicted upon us. I mean, that is disgraceful, and it's arguably defamatory. And parts of the media and also elected parliamentarians who use their parliamentary privilege to condemn women, to denounce women, and I can say quite a lot of these journos and these politicians really enjoyed doing it, and they inflamed the tensions, framing women who simply want to stand up for women and children, who want to stand up for reality and say that no, a man who wants to pretend to be a woman is not a woman. The fact that they're framing us as anti-trans, as bigots, as Nazis, I mean, they are throwing the worst slurs that they can at us. In an effort to denounce our message, in an effort to silence our voices. They are absolutely complicit in the disgusting mob mentality that has eventuated in Canberra, in Melbourne, and indeed in Auckland. I mean, they ought to hang their heads in shame, and I urge them to actually go and listen to the voices of the women, listen to what they had to say, because it's very reasonable. And many of the women, they've never spoken publicly. There were women from every political party. They've been kicked out of certain political parties. They were from all faiths and none, all ages. They were all sexualities, whether they're mothers or not, or married or what have you. We are all joined together to say no to these violent men who are trying to intrude into our spaces. And it says a lot about the state of our society right now when women who are trying to put their hands up to say, we say no to this, are being so badly condemned. It's like, you know, in Auckland, I mean, poor Kellie-Jay walked into Auckland 2023 and she woke up in Salem 1692. You know, the parallels between the witch hunting is extraordinary.
And we saw that, Katherine, with people, some of these trans activists who, a lot of them male, not pretending to be female, just male, who had turned up, who were boasting and posting videos about they've driven her out of town. And this is a woman, a small woman, who was assaulted. We've got footage of her being assaulted, and yet these men are celebrating it, so proud that they're posting videos on social media. And again, where is our mainstream media? The gaslighting we've seen on this issue in the past week is like nothing I have seen. A complete misrepresentation of the facts. How do you counter that? When you've got the bulk of the mainstream media against you, how do you possibly counter that?
It's a very difficult thing that we're currently faced with when absolutely you've got the media on side with the trans activists. But I think ordinary people aren't stupid. I mean, they're on social media. Those videos are getting out there. The stories are getting out there that the police, for example, let the neo-Nazis through. The stories, I mean, we're seeing what's happening to Moira Deeming down there in Victoria. I mean, that's going to play out. And she's a woman who stood up for women's rights, and she's now being denounced by the Liberal Party, even though she was the strongest Liberal candidate down there in the most recent election. But I think as these videos get out and you do see the optics, you see these mobs of enraged men and women cheering them on, and women actually being assaulted. I mean, it's absolutely not a good look. But, for example, when we had the police let the neo-Nazis through, or when we had in Canberra where the police, the ACT police, they had promised the organisers and the AFP that they would have barricades against the trans activists. The women were told they couldn't have umbrellas because it was seen as a weapon, but the trans activists were allowed to have umbrellas. They were allowed to have star pickets. My own father attended that rally because I couldn't. It's the first rally he has ever attended. And he said the trans activists, the mob, were just allowed to get closer and closer to the women. And I hate to think what would happen if they'd actually got their hands on some of these women, or on Kellie-Jay.
Well,
would they
Katherine,
have to tear apart? I mean, this is what it looks like it's going to turn into at one of these events.
Katherine, we called it here on this show several years ago when we named anything to do with this topic the war on women, which is exactly what it is. You mentioned in your list of women the mums and daughters and sisters and so on. You forgot to mention the lesbian community, who are also, many lesbians are appalled by this extremist transgender movement, and they regard it as deeply, deeply homophobic. We can talk about that another time. Just quickly before you go, you mentioned Moira Deeming. The political angle of this, the Liberal Party are considering expelling her because she was at one of your rallies. You yourself were silenced during the federal election. I've talked about this many times, what a disgrace that was. Yet we saw last night that a Liberal easily won in your at the state level in your area there. So you would have won easily had you been allowed to speak. I have no doubt about that. But just quickly, what do you have to say to the Liberals about Moira Deeming?
She is a politician with conviction. She was the most successful candidate down there in Victoria. The Liberals stand for nothing at the moment. They're not listening to modern Australia. And when you actually have a successful candidate of the calibre of Moira Deeming, you need to back her. Read the room, Liberal Party. It was an absolute wipeout at this election. And it's because they don't have conviction anymore, because they're not listening to the ordinary people. So they need to get their act together. Otherwise, they're going to be out of government for the foreseeable future.
And that's because instead of listening to reasonable people like yourself, they listen to clowns like Monty Photius.